My name is Matthew Bullock, and I'm currently working at Oklahoma State University.
I'm Jillian Detweiler, and I am an evolutionary ecologist who studies parasites at the University of Manitoba, which is in Canada.
My name is Sho Shirakashi from Japan, and I'm at Kinda University.
My name is Kevin Lafferty. I am a senior scientist with the United States Geological Survey, and I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I'm an adjunct faculty.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Cam Goder. I'm speaking to you from the biology department at the University of Lethbridge in southern Alberta.
My name is Mackenzie Kwok. I'm a parasitologist based at the National University of Singapore in Singapore.
I'm Chelsea Wood. Currently, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington.
My name is Ling Wong. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alberta.
Good question. I started my research as an undergrad in 1993. About 28 years now or something like that?
So I started working with parasites in about 1987.
Early 1980s. We're going back 40 years, maybe more, 45 years.
Let's see. Well, it's been over 20 years now, I guess.
Yeah, probably started in about 2013, I'd say. So almost 10 years now.
Over 16 years.
25 years, I think, since the undergrad.
Never boring. I'm going to have to say it's never boring.
I think it's pretty similar to most scientists these days.
Fun, but exciting.
A lot of writing.
It makes me very happy.
Exciting.
I am an academic parasitologist, and so for me, I get to teach people about parasites.
One of my real joys in my career is to walk into my lab that's just across the hall here and see the various things that students are doing.
Yeah, because I like the parasite and I like what I do, and I like to interact with the students and told them about the parasite that they didn't know about.
I spent a lot of time editing manuscripts for journals and supervising students and trying to help them with their work.
Most of my work deals with kind of a combination of field work and then experimental infections and experiments in the lab. And I get to go into a classroom 3 times a week and tell people about the students about the coolest weird animals out there. So I really like my job.
I think one of the coolest things about being a parasite ecologist is that you get to feel like you see a dimension of life that other people don't get to see. I think it's a really fun way to get to look at the world because you sort of like turn things upside down. The part that's visible is not the part that's interesting to you.
Well, I think there's quite a bit of diversity in the job, and you get to do quite a lot of interesting things each day. Parasitology offers a very nice mix of a lot of different things. One day you can be out in a forest in the middle, say for me, out in a forest in the middle of the jungle in Singapore, collecting ticks. And the next day, maybe you're in the lab identifying ticks or going through archival specimens that were collected by people almost a century ago. And then the next day you're in the lab doing genomics work, and then the next day you're maybe running some kind of network analysis to see how these species are all interacting.
It's diversity. It's the opportunity to be curious and to follow sort of a curious mind.
Well, I like the discovery, and I think that's what science is, the discovery.
I like the excitement of finding new things.
Yeah, I think that the coolest part is interacting with other students and faculty and just getting excited and talking about these things.
I love the freedom of getting to work on what I want to work on. So that's one advantage of being in academia. Freedom to think of my own questions and be creative about how I try to answer those questions.
I like the fact that I can study parasites and hosts together. I also like the fact that all hosts have parasites. So if one day I decide I want to study giant pandas, okay, I can go study giant pandas. That's because they've got parasites too. So that to me, I think, is that parasites can lead you to just about any kind of habitat, any place in the world, any type of organism you could imagine.
I guess when I teach, I always start out as, people view parasites as degenerates, right? And that was how a lot of early evolutionary biologists viewed parasites. But I tend to think of parasites as organisms in and of themselves that have needs, right? But what makes them unique is that they have to live in or on hosts. They have some sort of physiological dependence on those hosts, and that usually means there has to be some sort of harm.
Parasites are one of many types of consumer strategies. Organisms besides plants need to eat and consume things, and there are lots of ways to do that. And we tend to think about parasites as those consumers that don't need to kill their host to feed on them, and also feed on that host for a prolonged period of time. In other words, they usually just stay on one host during a particular life stage. So we don't consider, for instance, a mosquito to be a parasite. We call those micro predators, and yet things like viruses and tapeworms and malaria and stuff, those are all different types of parasites, of which there are a few different flavors.
To me, the coolest thing about parasites is that they're all around us all the time, even though we can't see them.
I found interesting about parasites is that here we have a group that is probably contributes to at least half of biodiversity and is arguably the most popular lifestyle on Earth, and yet it's a group of organisms that we oftentimes don't think much about in terms of, at least in ecology in my field. And so it's the amount of unknown and opportunity for discovery that is, I think, one interesting thing about them.
They're there, but we cannot see them. But they take so much important roles in ecosystem and all our life, and even the cultures. How we cook the fish in Japan is influenced by parasite. All the history between the interaction between parasite and human that's developed in culture in some world and in some regions. And of course, everything that we see is driven by parasite in some sense.
To me, each host and parasite species has its own unique relationship, So you can have a species of parasite that infects one group of hosts, one species of host, and they have a very different interaction with that host than a different species of host, right? And so I love that kind of like knowing all the information about those specific relationships and how they differ. And because of that, I think you can do all this comparing and contrasting of different ways different groups live and interact.
I'm really always intrigued by the nature of these incredibly intimate interactions, both from the parasite point of view, from the host point of view, and from the view of them together. Of course, they're a partnership. In many ways, they're intimate with each other. And it's those sorts of kind of intimacy questions on a sort of metabolic and physiological and immunological level that kind of drives the inquiry in my lab.
The other interesting thing about them from my perspective is all the incredible evolutionary adaptations that they have to deal with a food source that's basically hostile to them, right? They have to live in their food, and that's great because they always get to eat, but the food is trying to get rid of them and trying to kill them actively. And so how they manage to negotiate that is oftentimes really remarkable in terms of what types of strategies they've evolved.
Evolution is sort of finding ways for it not to be harmed by you as a parasite. So you have to come up with ever more ingenious methods of exploiting this organism whether that means silencing its immune system in the case of some parasites, whether it means attaching very, very tightly so that you can't be groomed off, or whether you're synchronizing your life cycle to its life cycle. All sorts of interesting sort of adaptations to be beating the evolution of this other organism that you're trying to get some sort of resource from. And because of that, they come up with these absolutely unimaginably good evolutionary sort of adaptations to exploiting these hosts in this fantastic arms race which never ends. And I think that makes parasites very, very exciting.
Yeah, this is a great question because lots of people are really interested about that, especially with all the changes that are happening to ecosystems because of climate change. And so for me, I primarily think of them as regulators of host populations. And then kind of scale that, you could scale up their effects to ecosystem level, all these different individual effects on different host populations, and then how they all interplay then to kind of have this ecosystem level effect.
The main role that they play in ecosystems is to regulate host abundances, and that can be really important because parasites do best in successful hosts. And so if they're more likely to be in successful hosts, that means that being successful has a penalty. That's a really important regulatory mechanism in ecosystems. If you never penalize the most successful, then you'd end up with just one or two species and that would be it. So parasites, I think, have an important role to play in keeping successful hosts in check. That promotes biodiversity. And I think that we can be thankful that the world is much more diverse due to parasites than it would be otherwise.
So we know certainly for some plant parasites like yellow rattle is a little plant that occurs in Europe. They actually attack and feed as hemiparasites on the roots of grasses. And so within meadows, when the yellow rattle is present, it weakens the grasses by taking their nutrients, and it actually makes more ecological space by knocking down these hyper-competitive grasses so different wildflowers can appear. And so then you have these beautiful mosaic wildflower grasslands, all because there's this one parasitic plant in there mediating the interactions of these grasses with all their competitors. And so they're actually increasing diversity. They're mediating these whole webs of life. And for instance, when it comes to human ecosystems, in many cases, parasites, in some cases, are actually helping their hosts. So for instance, in some salt marsh ecosystems, there were some very interesting studies done where they looked at the ability of tapeworms to bioaccumulate heavy metals like cadmium or zinc. And so when the tapeworms are present, even though they make up only a few % of the total biomass of these ecosystems, in many cases, they have more than 50% of the concentrated heavy metals within the ecosystem. So they're protecting their bird host and other species within the ecosystem by concentrating these very, very toxic heavy metals, which they can handle, but almost nothing else can. And so they're actually protecting the broader ecosystem from toxic compounds or toxic elements in this case, which I think is a really fascinating and surprising impact that these different parasites have. So people can sort of stick their nose up at parasites and say, oh, they're gross. But when you're like keeping everybody safe or keeping many, many organisms safe, especially these higher trophic level species like fish-eating birds and things that would otherwise be accumulating these heavy metals and potentially dying, when they're doing that, you've got to say, wow, parasites are having very, very useful impacts in these ecosystems. They're protecting a lot of species.
And so, yes, sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's difficult to define that absolute role, but other times it's obvious and critically important and absolutely phenomenally interesting and deserves much, much more study.
I think that my favorite parasite is Toxoplasma gondii. Well, I think it's probably, you could argue, it's one of the most successful organisms on the planet with respect to where it's found. So it's in every ocean, it's on every continent. It's up 1,000 meters in the air and it's down 1,000 meters under the ocean. So there's no other organism, even humans, that can be everywhere all at once. It also is potentially smarter than humans. And by that, I mean, there's some studies that show that being infected with Toxoplasma gondii can increase the IQ of infected female humans. And so that means that that partnership between you and your Toxoplasma is even smarter than you without your Toxoplasmas. There are so many, I mean, you could describe most of them as being pretty weird, but some of the weird ones are like hookworm, where the life cycle is so, it's just so, I mean, it works, right? But the fact that, you know, you swallow the egg and then you cough it up and then it gets into the lungs and it gets into the circulatory system. It's an incredibly, it's basically like, it's like if every time you drove to work, you got lost and spent 3 times as much driving around to get there and going exactly the opposite direction on the freeway than you needed to. So that's weird. Like what is the selective mechanism that causes such a strange life cycle to evolve?
I think for me, the weirdest parasite has got to be this little flatworm called Diplozoon paradoxum. And this little flatworm lives in the gills of carp and goldfish and things like that. It's very, very tiny. It's only a millimeter or so long. And this parasite, basically, this little flatworm, lives within the gills of the fish, but to mature, it has to form a monogamous relationship with another little worm. So another little worm will come along, the 2 worms will spoon with each other, and then they'll actually fuse together. So they'll become permanently monogamous. And once they're permanently monogamous, only then can they mature into adults and begin breeding. And so I think this forced monogamy, this marriage you can never escape from on the gills of this little goldfish or this little carp, I think is an incredibly weird, very, very, very rare in nature to find true monogamy. But these little worms seem to have perfected it. They force each other into this perfect monogamous relationship. And that's where they stay for the rest of their lives, till death do they part kind of thing. And so I think that has to be that species is probably, in my opinion, one of the weirdest parasites on Earth. Also, certainly one of the most romantic.
I think visually the most scary one for me are the hookworms. You know, because they have these big teeth and they latch onto your intestine and they drink your blood and eat your intestinal tissue. We often think of, you know, parasites as these like wormy or microscopic things. But the hookworms, they look like, you know, small little tigers with their teeth.
For me, one of the scariest parasites has to be guinea worm, Dracunculus medinensis, which is a parasite of people. It's very close to being eradicated, but it's not quite there yet. And it used to affect way more people than it does today. This worm takes up residence in the lower extremities of a person, and she can grow to a couple feet long, so she's enormous. But you won't know that you're infected until she decides that she is ready to produce her babies. And in order to do that, she creates a boil, like an open lesion on your ankle or foot or your calf. And she causes that lesion to burn. The pain is apparently nearly unbearable. And in order to relieve their pain, people will dunk their leg in cold water, which relieves some of the pain. It's also exactly what that worm wants, because she wants to be able to release her larvae into an environment where they can find their next host, which is a tiny freshwater crustacean. So Dracunculus medinensis, guinea worm, is scary in a couple of ways. One is that it's profoundly, disablingly painful. Another is that it actually manipulates human behavior. It makes people do what it wants. It makes people serve its own ends, which is basically, you know, the premise of 1,000 sci-fi horror movies. So I think that makes it pretty scary.
I just recently figured out, or just read, that there are actually parasitic tardigrades. And when I was looking this up, there's tardigrades that are parasites of sea cucumbers, which makes it even cuter. So yeah, my lab has been finding tardigrades in white-tailed deer feces. So we've been looking at it to find some nematodes that have some negative effects on moose in Manitoba. But every once in a while we find tardigrades in the feces, so I'm always trying to get my students to, call me so I can run over to the lab where they are and look at these cute little tardigrades like moving around. So anyway, tardigrades are our new spirit animal for the lab, I think.
Cute, yeah, cute is difficult, but I like some of the crustacean parasite, like amphipod, parasitic amphipod. They are attaching on mouth cavity of the fish, and those are kind of cute. When I open up the mouth of the fish, I see the eyes, that's watching me from the mouth. That's kind of cute.
Well, many of them are quite cute, I have to admit. But there's a cymathoid isopod in fishes, and it lives in the mouth cavity of the fish. Oftentimes, it replaces the tongue, and it's really cute if you open up a fish's mouth and there's this little animal looking up at you with its eyes, because it's got eyes, and it's sort of like it didn't think that you would find it hiding there in its little hole. It looks sort of bashful in the way that it's hiding out there, and so I think that they're pretty cute.
Cutest. Oh, well, larval liver fluke, lancet liver fluke, and the reason it's cute. Well, look at this. I've got all of these, excuse me, but I've got all this artwork for a cute parasite. So this is actually a felting of Dicrocelium that my daughter did. And this is either one of my kids or one of their friends also drew Dicrocelium here. The thing about Dicrocelium is you see the adult, you barely need to stain it. It's absolutely gorgeous. The ovaries are sticking out. The uterus, of course, is huge. It's a cute, beautiful parasite, at least for a trematode.
I work on fish parasites, so I go to this fishing port or the fishing market, to hunt for the parasite. It's quite cool because in the morning, all the fishermen bring a whole different kind of fish into the market or a fishing port, and I look around and I can see some of the parasite on the skins or on the fish. I can just pick them, and sometimes I buy the fish, fresh fish, and then bring back to the lab and then open up the gut or gills, and I find a new parasite or all sorts of different parasites. And of course, I can get to eat all the fish. I cook them at home, so it's quite cool. It's my favorite place for hunting, for parasite, and of course get the fish for eating, for dinner.
So we hunt for clinging ants. We hunt for attached ants. The reason that we go to this particular site, it's called the Cypress Hills Provincial Park, is because it's a combination of both. It's a prairie habitat, and it's a mosaic of basically grassland and boreal forest. That's why I went there initially with my family to holiday, because I just love that habitat. And it just happens that that's where some amazing parasites occur. So we know, for instance, Ribaria is present there in tadpoles. We know that Leucochloridium is there. So there are some parasitological greats in this small kind of manageable habitat.
I recently got to go out with a group of students from my lab that are working on terrestrial snails, and this is in the boreal forest. So Canada is kind of famous for having a big amount of boreal forest in the world. And the sampling that they were doing was in forests that remind you of Star Wars. So it's like you would think like an Ewok was gonna like pop its head up like from behind a tree at any moment. So lots of ferns, very green, tons of lichens and mosses, and it was just totally different from wetlands.
Oh yeah. There are so many, but probably my two favorite ones that I would really like to work on that I have not had a chance. Number one is pentastomes. The second group is these weird, really primitive organisms called dysemiids, which live in the kidneys of octopus predominantly, but also cuttlefish. And none of their life cycles are known, but they basically have like this single cell and one layer of cells around them. And they have all these weird larva stages that emerge supposedly out of the octopus and go into the open ocean, and then nobody knows what happens. And somehow you find them in the kidneys of octopus again. So very weird. You know, at one time they thought they were protozoa that were multicellular. Now they think they're multicellular animals that have just degenerated, you know. But very weird and very strange. And you know, when I was doing my grad work with Jill being in the lab as a master student, we'd always like talk about, hey, we need to run away and work on dysemiids because it would be so cool.
I think any other parasite would be the dysemiids in octopus, just because I get to do all my field work on a boat in the ocean and see really cool hosts as well as parasites, hopefully.
I think probably when I found my first species, my first new tick species, and sort of it was sent from some wildlife biologists that were working in the Australian Alps up above the snowfields. And they sent me these things that they took off these mountain pygmy possums, and they said, do you think you could identify these for us? I had been sort of consulting for them for a while. And I had a look at this thing and I was like, oh, this is a strange character. It was the same character, this thing called a sternal plate, which is present in the group that I did my initial work on, which was the sternal isotes, the paralysis ticks. They all have this little sort of solid sclerotized plate on their chest, on the underside of them. And I saw this on this thing and I was like, hang on, this doesn't fit any of the descriptions of any of the other members of this group that I've seen. And I was like, oh, damn, this is something new. This is very, very clearly new. This is really, really distinct. So there's this distinct new species of tick from a possum that's on the edge of extinction. There seems to be a pattern. All of the species I work on tend to be discovering new species just when they're almost extinct, which is unfortunate. But I mean, at least we find them before they're gone. But yeah, finding that species was definitely a big highlight. My first species was a really big highlight, sort of being like, wow, this is new. This needs a name. I'm the first person to recognize what this actually is. In more than a century of tick biology in Australia, this is a new one. But that's always a bit exciting.
One of the themes of my research program is to actually determine whether or not there's more diversity there than meets the eye. And so for us, what often happens is that we find that what we thought is one species is actually multiple species once we take a closer look both at how the parasites look, but also the genetic diversity of the parasites. And so I think most people probably already think of parasites as being quite diverse and kind of weird looking and doing weird things, but it's even more diverse and even more weird than anybody thinks.
I mean, it's very old school to say it, but I think that species discovery and description is incredibly important. It's the foundation of all the parasitology we do. If you can't name a species or identify a species, you can't study it. As of yet, we think that we've probably identified a small, let's say, proportion of the total parasite biodiversity. So if we just take, say, parasitic worms, for instance. So parasitic worms are vertebrates, so animals with backbones. There's about 75,000 species of parasitic worm described. This was from a paper called Homage to Linnaeus, which came out a few years ago. They found that about 75,000 species of parasitic worms were named. They estimated there could be as many as 300,000 parasitic worm species. So we're not even halfway there just for parasitic worms.
From my perspective, I think life cycles and transmission, people talk about those, but nobody talks about the variation, right, in life cycle. So usually we learn parasite life cycle as these diagrams, right, that people draw with these arrows. But in fact, when you actually start studying those parasites in nature, what you see sometimes is you have 3 or 4 different wheels, and each one infects different types of hosts, right? And so then there's all this variation, and not all 3 or 4 of those wheels always operate at the same time.
It would be hard to escape current world events. And I think one of the handles that we need to really understand is the role of humans, basically anthropogenic impacts on key features like transmission. So the role of fire, the role of all kinds of disturbances on ecosystems, how that impacts transmission is a key direction for the future.
There's no question that parasites are dangerous. In most parts of the world, parasites are a fact of everyday life. About 1.5 billion people on the planet right now live with intestinal worms, and that's out of the 7 billion who are currently on Earth right now. It's a huge chunk of humanity. So I don't want to downplay the importance of parasites and their destructive potential for people. A lot of the most common infectious diseases of people are caused by parasites. But that said, in the developed world, parasites are actually pretty rare, or at least parasites of people are pretty rare. And if you look kind of globally across all of parasite life, only a tiny fraction of all parasites have anything to do with people, right? That only a tiny fraction infect people or infect livestock or some other animal that affects human livelihoods. By some estimates, only 4% of all described parasites have anything to do with people. And that leaves this 96% of parasite life that's just out in nature doing cool stuff.
It's important to realize that our body has evolved over millions of years to deal with parasites. And so we're pretty well equipped to handle most of them. That's not to say that some of them aren't very bad to get and you want to avoid them. But the other thing is know where you are. You can manage your risk by having a little bit of knowledge about the parasites that are around you.
In my parasitology courses, I show gross parasites, and like by the end of the semester, there are always some student, they say, man, I was gonna stop eating meat, but even with like plants, I can't eat anything after your class. And so I usually have at least some part in the lecture that I talk about that almost every organism out there, right, has parasites that live in or around them, right? Most cases, you don't have very many parasites, right? You have like 1 or 2. And in fact, our immune systems evolved with those organisms, right? And so if you lose all those parasites, right, there's all these weird immunological disorders people in the US and in Europe are getting, right? Because they don't have any parasites. And our immune system freaks out, right? So it's a natural thing to have some parasites, right? You don't want to have like hundreds so you get sick, right? And so now people, things like MS and some of these other immune bowel disorders, right? Doctors are prescribing parasites to infect people, so all those immunological effects go away, right? So yeah, they're part of our lives, and we have to kind of realize that not having them is just as bad as having too many.
There's no question. Parasites are 40% of animal species, and they're almost never mentioned in a biology education, even at the undergraduate level. And I think that's an absolute travesty, that it needs to be fixed immediately, and that it's easy to fix. Kids are super excited about parasites. You don't have to tell them much before their natural curiosity takes over. It's a really easy subject to teach, and I think it deserves to be taught at every level of science education.
Yes, and even, in college, in freshman biology, because most parasitologists know that parasitism is the most common way of life, right? Every organism out there that has ever been examined has some kind of parasites living on them, right? Especially if you had a large enough sample size. Yet, I get students who are juniors, seniors who take my parasitology class, and it's the first time they realize, that there's so many of them, right? So, and like you asked before, these things interact in the ecosystem. They sometimes control ecosystems, right? And so, yeah, it'd be nice if kids knew about them earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly all biologists should be taking some parasitology. if you go to almost every university and you're, say, doing a zoology degree, you spend a huge amount of time on vertebrates. Vertebrates make up a sliver of Earth's animal diversity. And within that sliver, almost none of, like, vertebrates are like, I don't know, 5-10% of total animal diversity. Very, very little. And yet we spend 3-4 years almost exclusively studying mammals and birds, which make up an even tinier slice of that vertebrate diversity. They're not even half of all the vertebrate diversity. It's all in the fish and the frogs. So we work on this very tiny niche group of animals, and we neglect all these invertebrate species, particularly insects and particularly parasites, which is where a huge proportion of Earth's diversity is.
I think it would be great to emphasize the role of parasites, this notion 40 to 50% of all organisms on Earth. The notion of COVID and the anthropogenic role in it in terms of post-switching, it would never be too early to bring that up in school and to bring it up and talk about things like transmission, parasite reproduction, the role of disease, not just in humans, but in wildlife, and its increasing role. So yes, all of these things I think would be for someone designing a curriculum, whether it's in junior school, even at university. I think we need to revisit these roles that are becoming more and more important.
Yeah, definitely. I have no regression about this, and I'm happy what I'm doing here. So I think I choose the same path. Yeah.
Hands down, I can't imagine doing anything else. I have no idea what I would do if not for this. And I don't think that there's anything that would kind of charm and entrance me and keep me as interested as parasite ecology has.
Yep. I mean, sometimes when politics and things like that get, in academia, I get crabby and pouty, and I'm like, I'm going to do something else because there's too much stress. But then I go home and I go, what else would I do? I mean, I really like teaching about parasites. I really like interacting with students. I like playing with all these cool animals, so yeah, I don't think I would want to do anything else.
Now, the answer to that is absolutely 100%. Yes, for a curious biologist, for a curious person. I can't think of a better place to be.
And sometimes in academia, especially before someone gets tenure, you're often thinking about all the alternative career routes you may need to pursue in case tenure doesn't actually happen. But I would say that I have absolutely no regrets. I find what I work on completely fascinating. There's always lots of unknowns, so I never feel like I'm reaching the limit. There's always more questions to ask.
I would go further back in time. So I wish that I knew about parasites even earlier. Like now we have these undergraduates coming to our lab who are really keen on parasites and they're really excited, they're very curious. And I wish I was like that as an undergraduate.
Oh, absolutely, in a heartbeat. I have no second thoughts about that whatsoever. I'm so happy that I ended up here. In fact, if I went back in time, I would tell myself as a sort of 4-year-old that wanted to be a paleontologist working on dinosaurs, I would say, forget dinosaurs, work on dinosaur tapeworms.
Is there any other thing you would like to share?
Well, I think studying about parasites and just being curious about them is a good thing, because you have to approach it, I think, by thinking about that those organisms, also have their own lives, right? Because a lot of times we think of parasites as a thing you want to get rid of, right? But they're just like any other living organism, right? And now people are actually, or at least some scientists are actually talking about, conserving parasites, right? And someone goes, why in the world would you do that? I mean, they're causing things to get sick, right? But because all of these parasites, or many of them, evolved with a lot of the hosts they infect, right? If you get rid of them, other nastier things can come in, infect those animals, and they could get really sick, right? So I think that the big deal is that I think the general public needs to become aware of parasites and not just think of them as kind of the bad thing, but look at them more from a curiosity perspective, right? And wonder. I mean, obviously, I'm not telling people don't go try to get infected because that's not a good idea, but you want to, try to learn about them and understand them and not just think of them like gross, I don't want anything to do with them, right?
To me, again, it's the phenomenon that we need to better understand and to better teach and to better sort of come to grips with when we are not just researching, but also sort of doing our outreach.
We need to start thinking very seriously about conserving parasites.
My main message is parasites are a normal part of every functioning ecosystem. There's no place you can go and not find parasites. And if you go someplace and you don't find many parasites, you should be worried. That usually is a sign that that place is not doing very well. And that's very counterintuitive to the way that most people think about parasites, because we're used to thinking of parasites as problems because they cause problems for us, and that's fine, I get that. But in the big scheme of things, parasites are playing roles in nature the same way that predators play roles in nature. And 30, 40, 50 years ago, people looked at predators and thought that they needed to be exterminated because that was a bad lifestyle to have. And now, we look at lions and tigers and wolves and things, and we think that's an important target to conserve and for conservation. And so I think that as we become more enlightened about the way nature works, that we can extend the same courtesy to parasites that we've been recently extending to predators.